When was the last time you were completely wrong about someone? Not a little wrong. Completely, embarrassingly, painfully wrong. You were so sure you had them figured out, and then they said something or did something, and the whole picture you'd built of them just collapsed. And you were left standing there wondering how you missed it. The truth is, you didn't miss it. You were never taught to look for it. We spend 12, 16, sometimes 20 years in school. We learn how to calculate the area of a triangle. And yet, no one ever sat us down and said, here's how another human being actually works. There's a field of study that's been around for over 100 years. Researchers call it attachment theory, and what it essentially says is this: the way you were loved as a child becomes the blueprint for every relationship you have as an adult. That's not poetry, that's neuroscience. A psychologist named John Bowlby spent decades watching what happens when children bond with their caregivers and what happens when they don't. What he found was unsettling in its simplicity. Children who grow up feeling consistently safe and seen develop what's called a secure attachment style. They can get close to people without losing themselves. They can handle conflict without falling apart. They can let someone love them. But children who grow up in environments that are unpredictable, or cold, or overwhelming, they develop something else, a strategy, a survival mechanism that looks, from the outside, like a personality trait. The person who's always a little distant, who seems emotionally unavailable or allergic to vulnerability, they're not cold, they're protected. At some point, getting close felt dangerous, so they learned not to. The person who needs constant reassurance, who checks in too much, who panics when you pull away, they're not needy, they're terrified. Because somewhere in their history, love came and went without warning, and they never stopped bracing for it to disappear again. When you really understand it, something shifts. You stop taking people personally. Because most of what people do to you isn't about you. It's a rehearsal of something that happened long before you arrived. The psychologist Alfred Adler believed that almost everything a person does is motivated by one of two things: a desire to belong or a desire to feel significant. That's it. Two drives, playing out in every conversation, every argument, every act of generosity or cruelty you've ever witnessed. The colleague who takes credit for your work, they don't hate you. They're terrified of being irrelevant. The person who becomes impossible to disagree with, they've confused being right with being worthy of love. The moment you realize that almost every difficult behavior you've encountered has fear underneath it, the world becomes a different place. There's a concept in social psychology called the fundamental attribution error. It describes something we all do constantly without realizing it. When someone else makes a mistake, cuts you off in traffic, snaps at you, lets you down, we explain their behavior through character. They're reckless, they're rude, they're selfish. But when we make the same mistake, we explain it through circumstance. I was distracted, I was tired, it was a bad day. We hold ourselves in context, we hold everyone else to a fixed verdict. So what would I study if I wanted to understand every person I meet? I'd study the invisible histories they carry into every room. I'd study the childhood logic that became adult behavior. I'd study the gap between what someone says they want and what their actions reveal they need. I'd study the way fear wears the costume of anger, and grief disguises itself as distance, and loneliness sometimes looks a lot like arrogance. I'd study myself, relentlessly, uncomfortably, because you cannot see clearly in others what you refuse to look at in yourself. And then I'd practice the hardest thing of all. I'd practice staying curious about people instead of closing the file on them. I'd resist the verdict. I'd ask one more question. I'd remember that every person I have ever dismissed, misread, or written off was living through something I knew nothing about. Because nobody is just the way they seem when they're scared, or tired, or cornered, or grieving in ways they don't have words for yet. Every person you meet is an entire world that has been shaped by forces you can't see, surviving wounds you don't know about, trying, however clumsily, to feel like they matter. The question isn't whether people are worth understanding. The question is whether you're willing to do the work it takes to try. And if you genuinely are, I promise you that the world will never look the same again.